Hello, everyone. Welcome to Manta's Small Business Expert Webinar Series. My name is Ivy Lamb, and I'll be your host for today's event, 5 Things You Should Know About Social Enterprise. If you want to make the world a better place through your small business, you're not alone. Many business owners have realized that building a socially responsible business comes with many benefits, not the least of which is the satisfaction of knowing you're making a difference to others. This webinar will cover the many resources available to those who want to start a social enterprise or incorporate more socially responsible practices into their business. Before we dive in, though, I want to cover some important housekeeping items about today's event. During the webinar, you should see a slide area, which will allow you to view the webinar. You'll also see 3 tabs: Ask a Question, Attachments, and Rate This. Click on the Ask a Question tab to submit a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond during the Q&A at the end of the event. Under the Attachments tab, you'll find more resources related to today's topic, so be sure to check those out. Go to Rate This to leave us feedback on this presentation, and you can also tweet about today's event using the hashtag MantaExperts. Now, if you're having technical difficulties, please email webinarhelp@manta.com. That's the only way we can respond directly to you. So again, if you're having technical problems specifically, use the email webinarhelp@manta.com. Now, on to our presentation. I'm excited to introduce our guest expert, Nital Parekh. Nital is the founder and CEO of Innovate Social. She is a licensed attorney with expertise in digital strategy and communications. She is also the author of the book, 51 Questions on Social Entrepreneurship, the host of the Impact podcast by Innovate Social, convener of Impactathon, and a frequent speaker, facilitator, and moderator on topics including social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, and ways entrepreneurs and consumers can engage in social impact. Today, she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself and her work, and talk about the basics of social enterprise. Then, we're going to cover the legal structures available to companies with a social mission, common social business models, and funding options. And, just as important as those nuts and bolts, she'll also talk about the mindset and the community behind the social enterprise movement. At the end, we're going to save some time for Q&A to answer your questions. So again, just as a reminder, you can submit a question at any time during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question tab, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can during the time at the end that we've set aside. So now I'll hand things over to you, Nital.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ivy, and it's great to join the program and to address small business owners all over the country. So as Ivy mentioned, my background is law by education, but I have kind of veered into this space of social entrepreneurship and social impact. So in this slide, I'll just kind of give you a few snapshots of some of the kind of the journey that's led to this work. So on the left-hand side, you can see I was actually born in Oklahoma City. My family is from India. Both my parents were born and brought up there. And so me and my siblings, you can see us in the bottom left, grew up kind of with this idea of different cultures and different realities coexisting almost in our heads, you know. So we would go back to India, visit our grandparents and family, see what we saw there, from everything from, you know, in like disparate poverty to incredible wealth, and then we'd come back and come to our school in the U.S. and try to make sense of a lot of that in our heads. So I think from a young age, for me, this idea of creating impact through whatever ways I could, like finding ways to make the world more equitable, has always been somewhere kind of seated in my mind. So I had a chance to go to UCLA for my undergraduate studies, and I interned at the U.S. consulate in Mumbai and actually volunteered in rural India. I was part of a lot of student organizations that were around kind of social impact. So it's always been a thread. And then after I graduated, I was thinking about my next steps in law school, and international law seemed like a great fit. So in the center, you'll see after my first year of law school, I studied abroad in Geneva and Strasbourg at the United Nations. And I thought really that was the place that I would just want to like unpack my bags and just kind of like, be in that space, because it combined so many of the things that I was interested in, international work and impact. But as I was there, I realized that there was a frustration that some of the people that had been part of the United Nations or different agencies around the UN had felt, and it takes a long time for change to happen. So I call it institutional patience. It's the skill that you need to kind of get to actually make change happen or to make things happen. And so I did finish law school, but I then knew that my path would be like non-conventional. I kind of knew that might be not the way that I am able to kind of have the parts of my career or work that were really meaningful to me. And then if you look to the bottom right, I had a chance to move to the San Francisco Bay Area about a year after law school. And I think it's here where some of the dots started connecting, because so much of what's happening in San Francisco is around ideas, like the craziest ideas, and people will say, yes, we want to pursue it, or we want to change the way an industry operates. And so I think there was a space here to think about, what if you use that incredible buoyancy of entrepreneurship and you pair that with social impact? And that was kind of my introduction to the space of social entrepreneurship, because there were some efforts that were underway that I kind of latched onto, and then started my work around, which was creating legal structures and business models and creating a pathway for this kind of intersection between social impact and entrepreneurship. And the top right photo is when I volunteered in India. It was after I graduated, between undergraduate and graduate school, and it was in rural India in a state called Gujarat, and they had suffered a major earthquake about 2 years prior, and so until I had a chance to volunteer with the group there, and definitely I feel like I learned much more and gained much more than I was able to offer. So just a little bit of snapshot about me as we're going into this. My work experience has been somewhat in the legal space, and then a lot in the digital strategy space. I worked at a website called Find Law, which kind of connected my legal skills and introduced a new skill set around digital strategy and marketing and managing online communities. So it was after a few years there where I've been blogging professionally that I started really looking at and learning about some of the new legal structures that were emerging. So in 2011, California was the sixth state to look at a new legal structure called the Benefit Corporation, and we will get more into that a little later. But as I started following that, and I actually kind of veered from my kind of professional job to really immerse myself into this space, I started a blog, because that was now a natural way for me to start engaging, keeping myself accountable by going to these hearings. I was going to Sacramento for hearings and meeting a lot of people in the space, but also a way to kind of catalog what was happening. So Innovate Social started as a blog. Over the past years, since 2011, it has become like our kind of a full platform with different content, programming, resources to really support the space of social entrepreneurship and help make it actionable. That effort led to publishing a book, 51 Questions on Social Entrepreneurship, which came out in December of 2015. And it's a Q&A style book all about some of the basics and some of the nuanced areas of social entrepreneurship, with the idea of how can you make this very actionable. So you can read it as a Q&A and just look for the questions that you have, or it can be you can read it as a story, because there's a storyline and character, so you can kind of immerse in that way too. These efforts have also kind of very organically led to a podcast, because as I was out in the world meeting many people in the space, I was really inspired by some of the stories I was hearing, and I felt like these stories need to be captured. So I first just started recording some of the interviews, and then kind of flipped that into a podcast. And we have over 100 episodes with thinkers and doers in the social impact space, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. And so there's lots of, it's great, because I think once you find the thing, and I'm sure many of you have stories that are similar, being in business yourself, once you kind of find the thing that you're either passionate about or very focused on, you can find other outlets and other articulations of it that are all complementary. So, that's been kind of the lead up to this. And so one of the questions that comes up, like, what is social enterprise? So I really think about it as using business to create social impact, or using business models to create social impact. So that can mean a lot of things. We have, like, what is a business model? Like, in that way, we think, is it only for profit? Is it nonprofit? And I think right now there's a space where you can really think more broadly about it, where, like, even nonprofit, some of the nonprofit organizations have amazing business models, and they can kind of fit under this umbrella of social enterprise or social entrepreneurship. And then you look at the other side of the equation and you say, like, what is social impact? So here it's written in society, the environment, and so those are all things that we think about: our community, the environment, the place that we live, the way that we're keeping our planet. All of these are aspects of outcomes that are related to social impact. So one of the interesting things about the word social enterprise is that a lot of this work, especially when you look at the business space, and especially small businesses, many businesses have been finding ways to have a business model and create social impact for generations before these terms were even popular. So I think this is we're at this unique time where we're kind of starting to formalize some of these terms in some way. So in the United States, the word or the term social enterprise is more broad. There's not a legal definition. If you go to other countries such as South Korea and I believe Italy, they actually have a legal designation for the word social enterprise. So you don't just use it kind of approximately. It actually, you register with the government, and there's a whole procedure around that. So it is also, as we are looking at social enterprise, and much of today's talk is more focused on what's happening in the U.S. In the book, there are some sections that look at other countries, but as it's one of those things that after you leave this seminar, I will guarantee you will see the word social enterprise in places that you just weren't expecting it, because it's in many articles are being written. But I would say just take a look at and see. What I find fascinating is how it's emerging in different countries and cities. So as you are reading articles or learning about it, just kind of note, like, where is this happening, and kind of what, when you're reading the articles, and what is actually happening, because you'll notice that, or I've noticed that it's kind of emerging differently based on what social issues are in different countries. So as an example, we look at some of the countries in Africa and South Asia, and there is a huge youth population, what they call like a youth bulge, meaning like there's a large youth population, and that population maturing is going to need jobs and is going to need other resources like that. So the kinds of social innovation or the community environment kind of innovative ideas and companies that are coming around, maybe being created to serve some of those needs that are pressing and imminent. And then you look at countries like China and Japan, where it's a hugely aging population, where you kind of think that some of the innovations that may come out that will serve the social sector, serve communities, serve disabled populations or the elderly, whatever it will be to serve, to kind of address that social issue. So so this idea of social enterprise really can be taken both geographically, it can be taken by topic, it can be taken many different ways, but it's a very interesting field, and it's a very timely moment to be talking about this. So one of the things that we want to talk about, and one of the things that small businesses should know about social enterprise, is that there are legal structures. So as I mentioned, I started Innovate Social following the Benefit Corporation legal structure in California. So that in 2011, that did pass, and actually fast forward to 2016, and 31 states or jurisdictions have some form of benefit corporation. And that's pretty massive. I always think we see that law is often the last thing to change, and to see here in this situation that the laws have changed fairly quickly over time and kind of gained a critical mass is also just a sign that the consciousness is like kind of shifting, both in our consumer population, in our workforce, in our entrepreneurship population, the entrepreneurs and founders. So we'll talk a little bit more about the details of Benefit Corporation, but that is just to take a snapshot. What that does is a C corporation is like a third entity, right? It's not like it's a person that has a personhood of its own. That's similar. That's the same as a benefit corporation. You can be a benefit corporation and a C corporation. What benefit corporation does is, instead of having only a fiduciary duty to your shareholders, you also have a duty to your stakeholders, which include like the environment or the community. And something that's really important to know for small businesses is that each state, so each of these 31 states or jurisdictions that have a benefit corporation legislation passed, has its own unique features of it. So each state has to pass individually, so each state might have different requirements and things like that. So it's really important to look in the state that you are looking to incorporate to understand what are the rules and regulations of that benefit corporation. Another legal form that has emerged is called a social purpose corporation. So as you may recall, I said in California, 2 forms were passing when I was starting my work with Innovate Social. So the other one was a form that has now been renamed to social purpose corporation, and about 4 states have this form. And so it's very similar to the benefit corporation, and we'll look at some language ahead. But in general, instead of saying you have a fiduciary duty to all stakeholders, you could often in social purpose corporation just choose one kind of social impact you want to make. So this can be useful for companies where like it's maybe a very established company where kind of implementing social impact across every part of it will be very challenging because it's maybe reached a certain scale, or it's very deep in a certain funnel that is not like it's on the technology side or on the manufacturer, something where it's not directly related to social impact, where you could identify a particular kind of impact that you're trying to make. Another form that we'll talk about a little bit more is called a low-profit limited liability company, also called the L3C. And this was actually preceded all of this whole benefit corporation movement, but it had a very specific goal in mind. And so because that goal hasn't exactly been met by the federal government, it was to offer, to be able to have social enterprises that are for-profit receive funding from foundations through something called a program-related investment, PRI. But since that has not kind of gotten the blessing of the federal government, that is kind of I think of it as a legal form that's in limbo a little bit. So the states that have it still, there are about 11 states that they are still, they're not doing often much more with that, but they still, honor that and recognize that. And there are also ways that you can mix and match, to achieve this goal of having a company that has a social impact or purpose. And then, and so we'll kind of get into a little bit of this. And one of the detractors of not being able to see you or talk, or kind of see your expressions, as I know that sometimes some of the legal information can be a little dry. So I'm going to go over that a little bit more quickly, and in the Q&A, I am happy to drill down more if this is of use. Otherwise, we just lose all of our attendees, who want to kind of get to some of the other areas. So with benefit corporation, as I mentioned, there are a few requirements. So just looking, the requirements that you see are kind of like the garden variety, like what the organizing group called B-Lab kind of came up with as good features to have in every state legislation for this. But one of the big things is having a material positive impact. And as I mentioned, this also involves expanding this idea of fiduciary duty to stakeholders. And then for some states, such as California, another important part is that the way that this is all measured or judged, because you may say, okay, well, how is this all measured that, you're creating social impact and whatnot, is through a third-party standard. So using like B-Lab, like the organizing group actually has their own standard called the B assessment. So there's many different, there's a few different third-party standards that you can adopt and actually still be able to use to have your benefit corporation legislation. And then the next one is a social purpose corporation. And as I mentioned, you have to list a special purpose that you're trying to create impact within. So that could be something like education or charitable giving or something really specific that's related to your field. So, if you're interested in this legal structure, it's a good idea to check whether your state or the state that you want to incorporate in has this, and then start thinking about what is the way that you want to delineate that or kind of articulate what that specific purpose is. And then we talked about the L3C, the low profit limited liability company. And so, as I mentioned, this was kind of created for this use case of having program-related investment. Because that has not been kind of, brought forth by the federal government side, one of the states actually, I think it was North Carolina, actually repealed their L3C legislation. I've never heard of, you don't hear that case very often. But so there is this, if you are thinking about this form, just look really carefully as to whether that meets the needs that you have, and whether its acceptance or it's kind of whether it's known enough to be valuable to the work that you're doing. Because right now, if you are looking to a foundation for any kind of funding, you still will have to do the due diligence and the kind of, which can be kind of onerous and lengthy, that you would have had to do to have your L3C status as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we talked a little bit about mix and match, and so there are different ways that companies are and organizations are finding are able to kind of make these different structures work for them. So one is, I mentioned a nonprofit. Nonprofits can be social enterprises in this broader aspect of having a business model and pursuing social impact. But you will also see sometimes a mix and match where a company has a for-profit and a nonprofit. So there's a great example. Embrace is a neonatal warmer that was developed by two students from Stanford or two graduates from Stanford, and basically that is like a base of the pyramid. It serves the poorest of the poor. They've taken it to developing countries, and it's a way to keep newborn infants warm, and that kind of really increases their life expectancy or their survival expectancy within the first few weeks of life. So that's a really interesting social enterprise. What they decided to do is have a nonprofit that holds the intellectual property, and then they license it out to the for-profit, and that way they kind of imagined having, as other groups or organizations wanted to use the technology, they could kind of fund the nonprofit in that way. I'm not sure, I think that the mix and match for nonprofit and for-profit can be, I think it's a great idea. One of the challenges with that is you often need two law firms, to kind of serve that. And that can become a lot of logistics, and it can become a little bit, could be expensive as well. So it's something just to think about. But that is something, this could be a great idea for a really established company that is kind of going one direction, but is also wanting to create another business or product or service that is serving either underserved communities or people in developing countries, or the base of the pyramid, as I mentioned, which is the poorest of the poor globally. So that's kind of another mix and match thing. And then just a few of these other ones. This idea of having two structures we call a tandem, a tandem form, because you have two different legal structures working towards the same goal for your social enterprise. And then the hybrid is often referred to with these new ones, such as the benefit corporation, because it's not the traditional for-profit, and it's not a completely nonprofit. It's kind of in the road, like in the middle road. So those are some of the ways that people are mixing and matching. And we'll get to some of the other parts going ahead to talk a little more about crowdfunding. So now we talked about this is. I'm sorry, I may have given Ivy not the most updated version, but so 31 states and jurisdictions have passed the benefit corporation, and you can take a look on this map and see in red the states that are working on it, and some of the gray have turned to red now. So DC, has it as well, and a number of states. So you can see that there's a pretty good mix of states across the country that are now having this kind of form, this legal form. And one of the really interesting things that I learned through covering for Innovate Social is that there are so many steps to pass a law, but passing the law is really just the beginning of the whole arc of having of adoption and having people actually use the law. So though many states have passed it, you still see some of the, like Delaware, New York, California, Nevada are still the popular states for actually incorporating as benefit corporations. And so just to give you an idea of the timeline that it took for this to happen in California, it started in the 2000s and the early 2000s when some different social impact leaders met at the Aspen Institute, which is kind of a place for social impact leaders, and it's kind of well known. And so this idea kind of was sparked at that time, and in 2008, the VLab introduced what is a constituency statute, and that was in one of my earlier slides, and that basically is about 31 states have passed constituency statutes, and that allows companies and corporations to make ideas that are not solely for the purpose of increasing shareholder wealth. So it kind of puts a buffer in that space. There is another buffer called the business judgment rule as well, but certain states have passed that. So the constituency statute is not necessarily just for social enterprise at all, but it's something that social entrepreneurs or social enterprises can leverage if they're trying to make decisions for their company that are not strictly, maximizing shareholder wealth. So in California in 2008, that was introduced, and it kind of passed through all of the committees and assemblies and whatnot, but it was not ultimately signed by the governor. So in 2010, this was kind of resurrected, and there were two different groups that were introducing two different social enterprise bills, and then they were both passed and they went into effect in January of 2012. In 2013, this is notable, as some of you may know, that Delaware is a very popular state to incorporate because it has very well-defined laws and it's business-friendly. So one of the things is, in this whole benefit corporation movement, the organizers kind of imagine that Delaware may not pass until much later than, based on, than from other states, because it is such a stronghold for what we think of it as corporate law and corporate business law. But in 2013, Delaware became the 19th state to pass the benefit corporation legislation. And then since that time, as I mentioned, 31 states or jurisdictions have passed. So I think it's a really fascinating story of the passage of this, because even though we're seeing and reading about it now, this has taken decades, to kind of get to this place. So it's very interesting. So another thing that I think is really important and maybe even more applicable in business model for small businesses been more applicable than legal structure is the business model. So there's a few different ways you can think about business models, and there's a great resource called modelsofimpact.co, and that has over 100 different business models that social enterprises and social entrepreneurs are using. But here are some ones that are useful to know. So you may have heard of Tom's Shoes. They're a very popular shoe brand. They're on track to becoming one of the first billion-dollar social enterprises in the United States. And from day one, from the very first day that they started their company or began thinking about it, they had a one-for-one model. One pair of shoes is donated for every pair that is purchased. Now they've expanded from shoes to other. I think they have a coffee place. They have eyewear. They're doing other kinds of things, but they still have kept this model. One of the things I really like about that model is that it's very easy to explain. In a second, you get it. Like, you understand one for one, whether you're explaining that to your investors, to your consumers, to your partners, to your future employees. It's a very simple and easy model to understand and explain. So I think and also to track. It's also a great model to track. So there's ways that, companies can incorporate something like that, where it's a subsidized model where you're kind of either fully or partially subsidizing your product for certain populations through the purchase by others. Now, one of the kind of areas of controversy that Tom's has come under, because it was one of the first companies to do this, and it became kind of popular in fashion magazines and whatnot as well, is that there's a question of whether giving and donating a pair of shoes really gets to the root problem of what is causing that inequity or that situation where there aren't enough shoes. So, some people wonder, is this kind of more of a Band-Aid solution than actually, creating systemic or like kind of long-lasting impact? So I think that that's a fair question and discussion, and it can lead to some kind of some really good reflection on where the space has come and where it's going. But I guess to that, I would say you often need to start somewhere. So I think it's the fact that they have started in this way and become as popular as they are. They've kind of paved the way for other business models like this, or other businesses to kind of scale in a similar way, where impact is not a side thing, but it's part of their value proposition that they're offering. So I think it's a great discussion, and it's undeniable that I think they've given over 4 million shoes. So their impact is also, it's also measurable, and it's significant. So but I think now we're at the next stage of social enterprises, where new companies are thinking about new ways to incorporate impact in business, and so there are other ways that companies are doing this. And I'm seeing the question for this. I'm just going to repeat the resource I mentioned, and that's modelsofimpact.co. So another business model that you can look at is Salesforce's. Now, Salesforce is not a social enterprise. They are not, founded for the reason of having social impact, but they have a model where social impact is already baked into it. It's not like an elective thing. It's already part of it. And so their model that they've really popularized is the 1-1-1 model, where 1% of their product, 1% of their revenue, and 1% of their employees' time goes towards social impacts or charitable causes. So, one of the other kind of salient parts of their model is that it's very easy to explain. It's easy to explain, to measure, to report, and so that's another option for a business, to think about is, can you come up with some percentage model, and that way you're not wondering, what is the model that I'm going to use to provide some impact. It's already part of your it's already part of your financial statements, your impact reporting, and all of that. So that's something to look at too, like that's a percentage model. Now another model is something that's kind of what I would call freemium. Freemium is a newer word that's often used to describe apps and technology companies that offer a product completely for free, and then offer some in-app purchases or kind of other features for pay, but their base service or product is free. So one of the very interesting stories that I came across in researching for the book and the website was this of the Aravind Eye Clinic in India. So this was started by a family of ophthalmologists. These were all eye doctors, and one of them, funnily enough, came to the U.S. in the 1980s and saw McDonald's, saw how efficiently it was run, and was inspired and said, I want my company, and I want something that I create an organization to run with that kind of efficiency. And so when he came back, they started Aravind Eye Clinic as an 11-bed clinic. I think it was in the 1980s, early 1980s. And over the course of these years since, they've done millions of free eye surgeries. So basically what they did is they kind of created a system that was so efficient that they were able to get their patients in, out, and deliver very excellent kind of service. Because of that, whether you are poor or not, you would want to go to that place because they've done tens of thousands of eye surgeries. So they have it down to like an art and a science. And actually medical groups from around the world come to visit that eye clinic just to observe and understand how they've been able to kind of achieve scale and still maintain such a high level of excellence. So this is a model where if you're doing something that is scalable, and the paid part of this model is that they don't turn anyone away, so for lack of funding to have an eye surgery. But what they do is they offer some premium services, like, an individual suite for someone that is like wanting, having a surgery, or, and then the people that can pay, they're able to, they were able to give more, and that subsidizes the payment for others. So one of the things that they've been able to do, because they kind of went on a scale model. They try to become really good at what they do, and then find a way to monetize that their kind of excellence in that space. So that's kind of another option as well. So this is just like a snapshot. The very interesting thing about business models is that we often can come across a business model a little bit like just through trial and error. So though there are a number out there, I have no doubt that some of you may like create business models that have impact embedded in it in a way that hasn't been done before. So there's a lot of creativity and innovative thinking around this. But the idea is that how do you have a business model where impact is really integral to it? So it's not like a side thing. It's not something like a CSR initiative, or something that is kind of elective, where if it's, if 1 year the business is going one way, you say, okay, this is not happening. Then I think that commitment to impact, I wouldn't call it social enterprise. It's because it's more elective. But if it's part of the way you do business, then I would really think, okay, maybe you're now on this path of being under this, category of social enterprise. And now the other thing I think that small businesses should know is that there is funding available for this. So there's a few different kinds of funding, and I want to walk through that. And this is pretty important. So I want to try to go through these, and I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A as well. But one of the areas is impact investing. So we may have heard of venture capital, or if you watch Shark Tank, as I do, you watched the sharks kind of either give money for a percentage of equity or not. And so there is this space within venture capital called impact investing, where investors similarly they provide funds for maybe a percentage of equity, but they are looking for not only a return on their investment ROI, but also a return on impact. So they actually want to measure and kind of track the impact. So this is still a small area of investing, but it's kind of growing. And so this is great because some social enterprises that have a dual purpose, to create impact and create profit, they don't fit very well for regular investors and regular venture capital. So having this subset of venture capital is really important, and it also again shows this kind of shift in consciousness happening, including on the investment side. Now, we've also heard about crowdfunding for donation. I'm sure some of us have donated to Kickstarter, Indiegogo campaigns, and other crowdfunding platforms. So now this can actually be a valuable form of funding for social enterprises as well. Even though it is a donation-based funding, it can be really valuable in validating your idea or product or service, because if you run a campaign and it's like 200% overfunded or something like that, that is something you can then use to go to other investors or other groups and say, what we're building is something that people really want, and that can maybe help get some traction. Also, crowdfunding for donation, if you've ever done a campaign, and I have done one before, it is like a full-time job. It is a lot of work, but it's not just for the funding. You're also doing a lot in the sense of marketing and getting the word out. So the idea is that by the time your product is ready to ship or your service is fully at scale, people already know about you versus trying to let people know after it's already, been in progress. So you kind of take people along the journey. So that can be really valuable in growing your business and growing some traction. Something that was passed along with the Jobs Act of 2011 was crowdfunding for investment. And now, so there are ways that even non-accredited investors, which wasn't possible before, only accredited investors could invest in early stage startups, but now non-accredited investors can invest. And there's another part of the bill that will also allow that to be done online. So there's some different stipulations and different regulations around that, and that's something that you can definitely Google, or there's more in the book on that as well. But that's something that I think is really valuable. Again, this was not created for social enterprises, but when you're able to crowdfund to individuals who probably care more about your impact than maybe traditional investors or banks or foundations, or not foundations, but venture capital, there's a chance that you can find some different kind of support and people who care a lot about the issue that you are trying to address with your company. So yeah, and then the other part is foundations. As we mentioned, program-related investments can be made to for-profits and nonprofits as well. There's something else called the social impact bond, and it's actually a misnomer because it's not really a bond, it's more of a contract, but it involves three parties, or three sectors: then a nonprofit sector, a for-profit sector, like a consulting organization, and the government. So with this, there's some issue, and this is often used for recidivism, which is like return to jail for people that have been in prison, that how do you reduce the rate of recidivism? And so they've tried some different plans around with the social impact bonds, where you have a nonprofit that's working on the side of like the issue. That they have the knowledge expert on the issue. They work with maybe a for-profit consulting firm to actually implement. And if they are successful and they reach their target, then the government actually pays. So then, so it can be a win-win-win because it's also the government objective as well. So then there's also the traditional funding through banks and venture capital and other kinds of funding that is available. And so the last thing that the fifth point is that you are not alone. So I know if I'm interviewing so many social entrepreneurs and social enterprises, it can feel like a lonely world because it feels like everything can be uphill. You're trying to measure impact. You're trying to create impact. You're trying to create profit as well, and it's so it can feel like there are many variables and it's kind of hard to find support. So I wanted to offer some different things that I've come across. So if you use social media such as Twitter and whatnot, some great hashtags that you can follow are SOCINT. It's short for social entrepreneur, social enterprise. IMPINV, which is short for impact investment, and SOCIN, which is kind of short for social innovation. So those can lead you to some resources that are valuable and help you kind of navigate the growing social media space of finding content on this. Some other resources, Innovate Social has hundreds of blog posts and lots of tools and other resources, a podcast and an online course and some different things that you can use. The Stanford Social Innovation Review, SSIR, is a publication that has kind of become one of the premier publications for social impact and social entrepreneurship. They have a print version, and they also have an online blog version that is free to use, free to read as well. So that's a great place to kind of stay on top of what the emerging issues are and to go a little deeper onto some nuanced aspects of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. Santa Clara University in the Bay Area has something called the Global Social Benefit Institute that runs out of their Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And this addresses a really interesting issue that comes up. Now, to enter the space of social entrepreneurship, there's actually a number of ways to do that. There are these competitions, and you can get, some small amounts of seed funding, and, there's a lot of support. Corporations are, often, hosting hackathons and events and things like that to kind of promote this. But let's say you're a social enterprise and you've achieved some kind of success and you need to scale to the next level. Finding that next level of support and funding and, and mentorship, it can often be difficult, and that's what they provide. So they're kind of for social enterprises that have had some success kind of reach the next level. And it's an online program, and they have some parts of it that are live, but it's and it's been around for like the better part of 20 years, and it's an amazing program to look into. Tummel is an example of one of many incubators and accelerators that are emerging. So Tummel is for urban innovation. So if you're thinking about any solutions to urban problems that are impact-oriented, you can submit the idea to Tummel during one of their cohorts, and they provide some funding and mentorship, and there's you're with a cohort of people that are also working on ideas in that space. So they're kind of an area-specific or issue-specific accelerator, but there are many emerging. There's Imagine H2O that is around water solutions, and there's just a number of those that are emerging. So it's a great way, it's a great way to remind yourself that you're not alone, and also to surround yourself with people that are aligned and that are thinking creatively and that are driven by the same kind of goals to create impact. So that's another great tool. Triple Pundit is a great blog resource that has been around and has been publishing great articles on the space of social impact. Ashoka, you may have heard of, is a fellowship program that's been around for a number of years, and there's actually been a number of Nobel Peace Prize laureates that have been Ashoka Fellows. So they often work internationally on major, kind of impact-related issues and it's a massive network as well. So they're creating a lot of, change in very innovative and impactful ways, and so that's something to look into as well. Singularity University has the goal of affecting 1 billion lives by, I think, 2020. So they accept people that have ideas and small companies and whatnot into their cohorts of programming. And so you can kind of align with them if that's a goal that you have as well. And that's based in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. The last one is, you may have heard of Muhammad Yunus. He won the Nobel Peace Prize he won the Nobel Prize, I think it was actually in economics, for micro lending, which is a similar form as Kiva or some of those microfinance platforms and websites. So he was one of the founders of the Grameen Bank, and now he has his own Yunus Center where he's continuing the work and really bringing this idea of social business, as he calls it, and he defines it specifically, into its next stage of maturity. So these are just a few. There are many, many more, and if you use some of the hashtags, you can definitely find some of those. And I know we want to switch over to oh, perfect. So we're in Q&A now. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I really hope this was a valuable session. And so the purpose of the session is really to be valuable to you. So if anything I can answer can make this actionable and useful, please feel free to share.
Thank you so much, Nitul, for that presentation. All really fascinating stuff. And I just want to remind everyone, you can submit a question by just clicking the Ask a Question tab on the bottom of your screen. Type something in, and we will answer it now. So first question, say we have something coming in. Someone's saying, like, this is inspiring. I'd like to incorporate more social causes into my business, but I just don't know where to start. How do I find ideas?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways to kind of think of ways to ideate, like different social enterprise ideas and whatnot. One of the things that is really great is there are some events you can go to. So we actually hosted our first event called Impactathon in May, which brought together people that are all kind of along what I call the social impact spectrum to kind of ideate and to think through in what ways they would want to create social impact. Because I think some of it works better when you're in groups. You can brainstorm and actually use everyone's strengths. So that was one. There's a great organization called Startup Weekend that does these weekends, and sometimes they have ones that are focused on social impact. So those are ways to actually get out there and start doing something without launching something just yet, but it's a way to kind of work with the team and work on this hypothetical, business as though it was a real business, and then you can kind of decide, if that's something you want to pursue. And of course, just continuing to read and learn. There are multiple podcasts, not just ours. There are multiple online courses and books on this space. but to really start engaging and immersing yourself in the ways that people are thinking and measuring and articulating social impact can be really valuable.
Great. We have a question that references what you were talking about a little earlier about, legal structures. And we have someone who's wondering, well, what's the difference between a benefit corporation and a B Corp? Are they different?
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, good. I usually cover that. I missed that today, so I'm so glad that's that question. So, by being in this session, there's one thing I want to make. I want you to leave this session being able to explain this to someone else. That will be a sign of success for me, because this is a little bit confusing. As we talked about in the presentation, benefit corporation is the legal structure. So that is like something that you actually incorporate as. If you have another incorporation, you have to get a supermajority to kind of shift to that legal structure. So that is like the legal form. A B corporation is not a short form for benefit corporation. It's actually something completely different. A B corporation is like a certification, like what you would get for like, a fair trade certification or green, green kind of seal of approval kind of certification. So that any existing company can pursue that, show that they are, that they kind of within their assessment that they are creating social impact. And there's a cost associated with that depending on the size of your company, but you actually pay for that certification, and then you can list that on your website and everything like that. And that's a global, that's kind of like a global phenomenon, or it's a global certification. So that's something different. It gets very confusing because we think C corporation is an S corporation, so you think B corporation is the same, but it's actually it's kind of a little bit reversed. So it's that's a good question to know, and you can find a lot of it if you just search for B Lab. You can find out a lot more information about both the certification and the legal structure.
Great. We have another question from an audience member, sort of piggybacking off what you were just talking about, and they're wondering, are there major differences in the ways to operate a benefit corp versus social enterprise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would look at social enterprise as like the kind of the overall type of kind of business that is trying to create social impact, and benefit corporation is a specific articulation of that. So you can be a social enterprise and not be a benefit corporation. Though I would say if you are a benefit corporation, you likely are a social enterprise because, it's kind of inclusive of that. But yeah, so, with the one thing that you should know with benefit corporation, there are some reporting requirements depending on what state you're in. So for example, in California, the companies that are benefit corporations are required to do an annual public reporting of their impact. So, so that's just part of the requirement as you incorporate. So that's not true for Delaware. For Delaware, it's every other year, and it's for you just have to do it to your shareholders. But yeah, so I think some of the details of what is required for the benefit corporation will kind of distinguish, like how that actually operates. And you can again choose another legal structure, so you could still be within the social enterprise realm and not be a benefit corporation, or maybe you are kind of pursuing that impact through a certification, as well. So there's a few ways to do that.
Thanks, Neetal. So we have another question about, again, you sort of gave us a great overview of the legal structures. But so say if someone is thinking about starting a social enterprise or, again, maybe adding a part of their business, we're always wondering, are many lawyers aware of the legal structures? And of course, it depends on your state. Or do I need to seek out someone who specializes in social enterprise to help me with entity formation?
Yeah, that is a really good question. It's something, and that's why I like to give this talk to different audiences, because there's a chance that the attorney that you are working with may not be familiar with these legal structures. So there's a couple of things. One is that there's a number of resources online, and it's something that they themselves can research once it's on their radar. So you can actually be the one to put it on their radar, and even send them some of the kind of organizing websites around this. The other is that there's also a growing network of attorneys that are more nuanced and more kind of specialized in this. So you could, as you search for an attorney, you could that could be one of the things that you actually want to find out. Do they actively, work with social enterprises or benefit corporations, and what's their knowledge level, about that. So there's a few ways that you can, kind of address this. What is really valuable is that attorneys end up specializing in areas that are popular or common, right? That what they get normally asked about. So I have no doubt that as this field is growing and more businesses and entrepreneurs are asking their attorneys about these things, that those attorneys will, kind of become better versed in this. So one very interesting thing that I find really fascinating is that though all these laws have been passed, they haven't been tested. So if, a lot about law is about legal precedents. What has happened in courts? What do we know from what has happened before? And with the case of benefit corporation and some of the legal structures, there is no precedent yet. We don't know how the courts will handle this new kind of structure. So that is something I tell you because it's something to keep in mind even for you as a small business owner or entrepreneur, that if you are starting a company in this way, you may not, it's not a tested legal form yet. So you are a pioneer in some ways, and in some ways it's just something you have to balance out with your other variables that are, going into creating your business.
So we have a question, maybe just to give an example of kind of what you're talking about. Someone's wondering, can you share views on benefit corporation based in California versus Delaware? What are some of the key differences that a state might have?
And that's a great question. Those are two great states to look at because there are some more more apparent distinctions. So one of the things is that California benefit corporation law kind of mirrored the version that the B Lab was really kind of had in mind or was originating with. So like I mentioned, there's a few features such as annual public reporting, which can be a high standard for certain companies that are not as public or not as front facing with the way that their operations work and whatnot. So California requires a public reporting. It also requires a material positive impact, which kind of means that there is an impact in multiple areas. It's not just I'm just trying to create impact in our recycling or in our use of or redirection of waste or or elimination of waste. So it's kind of looking at all of your operations together. So how are you treating employees? What is the impact on the community? And there's a really exhaustive impact assessment that BLAD has that can give you kind of a numerical score at the end, and so you kind of know where you fall and all of that. So those are some of the kind of distinguishing features of the California Benefit Corporation. In Delaware, and not to make this more confusing, but the Delaware Benefit Corporation kind of looks more like the California Social Purpose Corporation. So this, it's kind of you have to choose one area of impact and you have to delineate that. So it's not as high as the standard of material where it's across all operations or all activities that your business does. In Delaware, it's also you have to do a biannual reporting every 2 years to your shareholders. So it's not a public reporting. So again, that demand for transparency is not as high as it is in California, and then it's every other year, so it's a little less frequent. So those are the big differences. Another difference is that some companies, especially if you are like a startup and trying to get funding and scale in that way, your investors, whoever they will be, are just used to investing in Delaware corporations. So they won't even it will be less of a choice than maybe if you choose the state of Delaware and then you choose a benefit corporation. That's how you kind of balance it. But that's another factor that can go into kind of deciding between California or Delaware.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for our Q&A. We're going to have to wrap up, but I want to encourage you, follow Nita on Twitter. She's put up her email address there as well. Nito, I'm sure you'd be happy to field, any further questions if people are interested.
Yes, absolutely. And there's someone noted it's Nithought Innovate Social, so that spelling is just like the website Innovate Social. But feel free to reach out. And though I couldn't meet you all in person, I really appreciate you all taking time to join the session and just engage. So yeah, and thank you, Ivy, for the opportunity. It's great.
Yeah, and thank you, Nito, so much for generously sharing your time with us today and sharing your expertise. Really wonderful, very educational. And I also want to mention to everyone, if you want to revisit any part of this webinar, go back and listen to a certain portion, it will be available on demand within 24 hours. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have extra materials linked in the attachment section, including a link to all of Manta's past webinars. So be sure to check those out as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and thanks for attending.